hidden in plain sight.
Hello, and welcome to Hidden in Plain Sight, the program exploring the life and work of famed Elizabethan poet and playwright Christopher Marlowe. I'm Julian Ng, your host for this investigation, and with me are our friends and resident Marlowe scholars, Dr. Peter Hodges and Carol Paxton. Hello, guys.
Hello.
Hello, Julian.
Now, in today's episode, we continue our investigation of what we know today as the Procreation Sonnets, the first 17 sonnets in the collection of 154 sonnets titled Shakespeare's Sonnets, published originally in 1609. With us again is our very special guest, Dr. Rachel Wifall, who's a professor of English at St. Peter's University in Jersey City, New Jersey. And she specializes in English Renaissance drama. Welcome back, Rachel.
Thank you, Julian. Hello, and hello, Carol, and hello, Peter.
Rachel, I'm so happy that you've decided to join us again today. And I would like to resume our discussion from our last episode with a question for you. As you know, Peter and Carol have been examining the Procreation sonnets from the perspective that Christopher Marlowe might actually be their author. And one of the reasons they have given for this hypothesis is that they were presented together as a gift from the Lord Burleigh to the Earl of Southampton on the occasion of his 17th birthday, in order to convince him to marry Elizabeth de Vere. You, however, have set the cat among the pigeons by proclaiming that the sonnets were not, in fact, composed as a discrete sequence, but may well have been written separately at separate times for various reasons and for various people. Now, I wonder if you could actually elaborate on that. Is there anything internal or external about these sonnets that makes you think that they should not be considered a single composition?
Well, I made some points in the last episode that are generally standard Stratfordian points, I suppose. Well, first of all, the first 17 do adhere in many ways, but there are themes in there that also echo throughout the entire collection. For instance, with the cycle of birth, decay, and death, and also the assertion, the poet's insertion of the boast that his poetry will make the beloved immortal, which is begun in Sonnet 15, but is also echoed later on in the collection. Also, I did make the point that a couple of Shakespeare's sonnets did appear in print earlier in the 1590s, excuse me, and these also appear in the collection of 1609, which can lead one to believe that they may have all been written over time and then collected after Shakespeare's death, as were his plays, of course, into the first folio. But as I said, there definitely is a cohesion in the first 17, and whether that was intentional at one point in time or a choice made by the publisher to collect that type of sonnet into a narrative, because there are other sonnets throughout the collection that adhere with one another too, kind of making a few little collections. That was basically my point. And we don't know, of course. They could have been intentionally put together, and they could have been intentionally put together as a series by someone other than Christopher Marlowe.
Wow, that's actually quite interesting, Rachel. I don't think we have seriously considered the possibility that the first 17 sonnets are anything but a sequence, or that they are not really the first of anything, but perhaps they might actually be a reordering of 17 sonnets composed separately. I think it sort of blows up the entire discussion. Peter, what do you make of that idea?
Yeah, I think it's a very valid question to ask. The first thing I would say is if we're looking at the first 17 sonnets as a group, my impulse is to ask, is there any reason within those first 17? Let's assume that I don't have access to any of the other sonnets in the collection. Let's just assume that I only have those 17. I don't know that there are other sonnets in the collection. I don't know anything about them. The only thing I have are the 17. Is there anything internal to the 17 that tells me I should go looking for other sonnets? Is there anything that begs the question, where's the rest of this? And that to me is answered in the negative. There isn't any such thing inside those 17 sonnets. So there's a natural gravity to them, it seems to me, that pulls them together and holds them together once they are together. Now, is that a chemical process? Is that like an atom of hydrogen and two atoms of oxygen, and you can't pull them apart without a thermonuclear reaction? There might be something to that. But the other thing that when I start asking myself, all right, what is the nature of the gravity that holds them together as a group, as a thing that I have to see as a thing by itself? If you gave that to me, what would I be satisfied with it? And I think there is that there. I think, in fact, that they act as a singular composition with a singular message. And it's a message that is developed, I would actually say, in the form of a greater sonnet. It's kind of a macro sonnet composed of 17 sonnets, because you outline the theme of the conversation, or at least the presentation, in the first 6 sonnets, saying, we'd love to have you get married and increase, and we have all sorts of themes and images that are brought to the fore, all revolving around that simple idea. And then you get into the next batch of sonnets, which I would say loosely is 7 to 10 or 7 to 11, which then complicate, very much in the style of a sonnet, complicate the message with deeper and perhaps even more ominous thoughts. What might occur if one does not satisfy the impulse of marrying and having children and leaving behind beautiful copies of yourself? What might happen is a widow, or worse, death, and obviously we're all going to do something along the lines of dying. And if you want to leave something behind as a legacy, the best way to do it, the natural way to do it, is to have children. So then, as a sonnet would do, taking that development and then reversing it, it then goes into a happier finish. It goes into the celestial option. And we start talking about the stars and the movement, the great canopy of fate, and all of that, which then leaves us with the impulse to go ahead with the original message. And then we get this final little dash, which is a bit like a signature. You get the final 2 sonnets, which introduce the poet himself and say, oh, I'm so very happy to be able to bring you this message. And please, realize that whatever I've done here, it will have no meaning whatsoever if you don't just go ahead and get married and have that little boy. So to me, that's a complete idea. And I don't have any desire to take anything out of it. I don't have any desire to take in, to look at one of or 2 or others of the sonnets that are contained in the 17 and separate them for an individual purpose. Rather, I think they are all strengthened and heightened by being together. And I don't have any obvious need to go and look for any other sonnets anywhere else, even though as Rachel points out, there are in the collection, now that we know there is a collection, since she brought it up, that there are others who echo some of these themes, and all well and good. I think, there's no surprise there. That's
Well,
kind
even
of how I look at it.
18, which is the subsequent, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, then brings up that, the same sentiment of, I engraft thee new, but, you live along in these lines. So, I mean, do we, 18 is actually considering continuing a point of the Procreation sonnets as well. So I do understand that it doesn't have the argument of, okay, procreate, but it is continuing another sentiment that is in there.
Well, I can see that Carol's dying to get in on the action. So over to you, Carol.
Right. Well, needless to say, I largely agree with Peter, but it's always valuable to look at the counter arguments, to play devil's advocate, if you like, and see how well the contrary case compares. To echo quite a bit of what Rachel said, the only absolute certainty is that all the sonnets were written in the form in which we now know them prior to 1609, because that's when they were published. Interestingly enough, only 13 copies of that first edition survive, and which might indicate that it was just a small print run, might indicate that it was essentially a pirated edition, and a lot of the copies were simply disposed of. And we also know that one of the very first purchasers of the book was, in fact, Edward Allen, the actor, who bought a copy shortly after publication and noted down in his papers, which still survive in Dulwich, that he paid sixpence for it. But the other thing we know is that at least some of the sonnets were written well before 1609. Obviously, we have Mears in 1598 in Paledistamia, mentioning the infamous, famous, whatever, sugared sonnets. And then in 1599, we have The Passionate Pilgrim, which includes versions. They're not exactly identical, but they are obviously what we now know as 138 and 144. Going back to the first 17 sonnets, yes, they're not original ideas. Yes, there are precedents, a lot of classical precedents. No, they don't name a particular individual, although I would see some significance in the persistent image of the rose, being a pun on Roseley Risley, Southampton's family name. Does 17 have any particular significance? Well, if you don't think of it as the 17th birthday present, well, then not really, unless you want to go into some really rather strange stuff about base 17 pyramids. But they are a thematically linked group. That is, I think, undeniably true. So does that mean that they were composed as a group? Well, not necessarily. And in fact, I have an example from, again, around about 1599, where a group of poems were, a selection from a larger group of poems was made and arranged in a very specific order, perhaps to tell a specific story. And those poems are Ovid's Elegies, as translated by Christopher Marlowe, 10 of which were published in a edition. We don't really know when it was published, but it's usually dated to around 1599. And 10 of those poems were published after a collection of epigrams by John Davis and 3 other poems by Ignoto, that is, unknown, anonymous. And those selected elegies were arranged to tell a story, which isn't exactly the story that Ovid tells in the full selection. So yes, we can cite a precedent for poems being deliberately arranged to tell a story.
Just like Carol, always playing devil's advocate. I love it. All right.
Right, but just a couple more things. But So why would the editor do this? Well, I suppose we could say that if it is or was indeed a pirated edition, then the reason for the unknown editor, maybe Thomas Thorpe, we could say, making a specific arrangement was to try and create something out of this disparate mass of material that vaguely resembled a sonnet sequence. 1609 is a bit late for a sonnet sequence. Perhaps that's why it didn't sell very well. Perhaps it was simply rather than being withdrawn, it was just a flop. And the fact that nobody bothered to publish them again until about 1640 might make us think that. So there, and all yours.
All right. Well, assuming we wanted to argue that these 17 sonnets were actually written in sequence, would they then be written to a particular person, or would they be perhaps a poetic device for Shakespeare, for Shakespeare's personal interest in the form? What do you think, Rachel?
There's so little known about Shakespeare's life that, it's hard to say. I know that, Peter has his theory about Marlowe's intentions, which were personal, and which is very intriguing. I do think so. Although I'd like to go back to Carol was just mentioning about Marlowe's translations of Ovid. So, Marlowe, we know, was university educated, and he did undertake translations, but also we don't have very much poetry from Marlowe himself. Obviously, he wrote A Mighty Line, and so his plays are poetry, but we don't have a lot of poetry coming down from Marlowe that is published as poetry, and also the sonnet, or at least let's say the 14 lines of poetry, which in a previous episode was extracted from Tamburlaine, while it does sit out a little bit from the content around it. It is not set apart. Is it an embedded sonnet? Well, it is 14 lines of blank verse. There's no rhyme scheme. I don't think we can call it a sonnet. We could perhaps think it's 14 distinct lines of blank verse that was inserted, but I don't know if we can make a case that that was a sonnet by Marlowe, or proof that he was in the regular habit of composing sonnets. Not that he couldn't compose a great sonnet, I'm sure he could, but we don't have the proof that he was regularly going about it.
Unless, of course,
He was commissioned.
Well, or we turn to, and I know Peter's spoken about this before, we turn to Harrington's epigrams and ask ourselves, who was Faustus? Harrington writes quite a bit about Faustus, who he obviously knew quite well, and has we only hear one side of it, but has a poetic dialogue in his epigrams with Faustus, who he tells, you should stop wasting your time writing sonnets and write epigrams, because you're very witty and epigrams are the superior form. If we think about who Faustus might be, then perhaps we do have evidence that Marlowe wrote sonnets, because other than the translator of the Faust book, and we have no idea who that is, it's a bit difficult to see who else would be given the nickname Faustus in the 1590s. Perhaps Peter.
Yeah, unless you wanted to be completely misunderstood. If you were to call me Faustus, somebody would look at me and go, well, you're not Marlowe and you're not Ned Allen, so who the hell are you? Julian, forgive me for not letting you turn to me, but I'm jumping in. To go back a little bit to some of the things Rachel's mentioned, Sonnet 18, I think it's fair to say, is not talking about marrying and having children. Certainly talking about somebody who's quite beautiful and is making a very complimentary statement thereby. But I would, as much as people would like to argue that even 19 and 20 should be heaped in to the first batch as a separate collection, I don't think that really stands close scrutiny. And I don't think that 18 really carries the same message that the previous 17 do. So I'll just leave it at that. I mean, people can differ in their opinions about that, but I wouldn't be looking for, as I was saying before, if I'm looking at the 17 as a contained package, I wouldn't be looking for 18. I wouldn't need an 18 to remind myself that the person I'm writing to deserves to have children because he's so handsome. I wouldn't need 18 to do that. I've got plenty of that going on in the first 17, so 18 doesn't call itself forward. And if I never saw it, I wouldn't think, oh gosh, he left something out, like the reason why you should have children at all. He didn't do that. He gave us plenty of good reasons. The other question I want to address is the issue of whether or not there was much poetry written by Marlowe. And I think it's fair to say that the one major poem that we have extant from Christopher Marlowe, which was posthumously printed, had an incredible influence, more influence than anybody at the time even perhaps appreciated, because it obviously inspired Venus and Adonis. One way or the other, it was the format and it was the idea, and it gave rise to Venus and Adonis. If you want to credit that to William Shakespeare, all well and good. There's no question, however, that if that is so, he must have had reference to Venus or Hero and Leander, couldn't get away without it. And we've also made mention of the fact that Hero and Leander and Venus and Adonis and the first 17 sonnets all contain themes that are interlinked and and not just the themes, but actual lines that are distributed backwards and forwards amongst those three. So to say that we don't have examples of Marlowe's work or whether or not he could write poetry, I would say quite the opposite. We have at least one very spectacular and unquestionably attributed to Christopher Marlowe poem that had a tremendous influence on all the poets who read the thing among his contemporaries and ever after. Not to mention, George Chapman then picked it up and tried to add his 2 cents to the argument, which is a whole nother deal. And
And you should check out season 1 for that.
Yeah, and it strays us off of the focus that we want to stick with the 17,
The Amours and also the Lucan. Yes, they're translations, but the Amours are not just slavish academic exercises in translation. I honestly, the more I think about it, and just read Marcus Stapleton's book, I mean, they are absolutely fundamental to so much in Marlowe's recognized canon, and so much that starts leaking through to the early history plays, to bits in A Shrew, to the Dark Lady sonnets as well, that I think to say that, oh, well, we don't need to think about the Amours when we're talking about what poetry by Marlowe do we have. I think that's a mistake. I think they are absolutely fundamental to this discussion. After all, most of the time, if we have somebody's juvenilia, we think it's really important. That people go completely nuts over the Bronte sisters' little books. Here we have hundreds of lines of poetry written probably when Marlowe was very young, late teens, maybe early 20s. And yet, on the whole, you look for papers on the subject, and yeah, sure, there are some. And as I say, I really would highly recommend Stapleton's books, but and there's a certain amount by Patrick Cheney as well, but they are not given the attention they deserve. And now you can tell me to shut up and go away and stop banging my drum. But seriously, there's lots more poetry by Marlowe than most people would say. Hero and Leander, The Passionate Shepherd, and Run Out of Steam. But you shouldn't, because there's hundreds and hundreds of lines more.
I suppose also the issue is complicated by the fact that a lot of these publications were published after his supposed death in 1593. And so then, you know, perhaps they didn't feel it was necessary to publish a dead author or publish in the name of a dead author. So it
yes,
might
especially
explain
especially one whose name was very vile esteemed. So.
Well,
Yeah.
I would like to turn our attention now to another slight topic, which is if these first 17 sonnets were sequential, were they actually then written as correspondence? And if so, to whom were they addressed?
Well, in the last episode, I did say that it perhaps could be a posture. You know, there is the famous letter of Erasmus at that the epistle to persuade a young man to marriage, and or encomium matrimony, and definitely there are direct references to this piece here. And, you know, it could be an envisioned addressee. We have a humanist educator, the point has been made, speaking to the younger thou. It just as, you know, we don't know who's being addressed with all of the sonnets that are supposedly written to a young man, but the gender of the addressee is only specified in perhaps 5. 1/5 rather, I'm sorry. The gender of the addressee is only addressed in about 1/5 of the sonnets. So it's really hard to say in most cases who's being addressed. Is it male or female? Is it you know, a mentee? Is it a lover? There's just a lot of hypothesizing.
So let me ask you this. If on the one hand, the answer is we don't know, we can't know, but the best thing that we can suggest is that one way to go about looking at them is to think of them as letters written to no one in particular, but letters that can be used to develop an argument that could be useful for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's they fall into various genres. And I did mention before too, there are also sonnets within the collection that are very obviously trying to challenge broad conventions, right? Of course, all the
But
dark
see, now
ladies.
I want to stop you there because you're going into the rest of the collection.
Well, they were all
And
published together, and you're
that's
saying it's
cheating.
intentional.
That's cheating. That's cheating, though. You
I
know,
don't think so.
17 is the 17. You gotta stick with the 17. If you're going to say these 17 sonnets were written at different times for different reasons, that's all you have. You don't drag the others.
Not really, because we did say that, you know, there are themes within the 17 that bleed out into the rest of the collection as well. And
You
if
said
you're
that.
arguing that
I didn't agree to that.
it's intentional, that we just established that 18 echoes 15, but you said 18 is not part of the 17, so it's not part of that collection. So
you said that.
Yeah, but I think we need to take a step back. So if they are a set of thematically similar but disparate in time and space, why? Was it just to order? Was it if you pay me 5 marks, I'll write a sonnet that will persuade your recalcitrant son to marry, or recalcitrant daughter to marry, for whatever reason? I mean, even unless something is entirely a formal exercise, can I write in this rhyme scheme and meter? then there has to be some motivation. It doesn't have to be some great artistic ambition. It could be money, but if it was money, who paid for them? Why were they paying for them? Why did they pick this particular person to write the sonnets? I mean, when one says motivation, one often gets into slightly, I don't know, grandiose ideas of artistic expression, etc., etc. But motivation, creative motivation, can be largely commercial. There's a whole big town in California that kind of runs on that. So who wrote them is one question, and I'll say he because I do think the author was a man. Why did he write them? Did he write them as a group because somebody asked him or paid him? Did he write them different times because somebody asked him or paid him? Was it a sort of side hustle business? Sure, I'll write you a couple of sonnets. These, I think, are quite important questions.
Well, I don't think we're going to answer all of them in this one session, but the arguments are certainly heating up. And is it going to be a case of too many cooks in the kitchen? Will that spoil the broth or will that make it much better? We're going to find out. But in the meantime, if you want to get a jump ahead, why don't you get a copy of Marlowe's Complaint, the book that started it all off? Well, once again, I would like to thank my dear friends, Peter and Carol, and our special guest, Dr. Rachel Wifall, for joining us for this wonderful episode. And we'll see you
hidden in